welcome to Bertha Centre's fourth brown bag as part of the series. The purpose of the series is to provide a regular forum for our broader community and ecosystem of stakeholders to discuss and share themes, research and practice from development to system thinking and social justice. Across the board, we have always wanted to have a regular space for this kind of sharing, connection, and exchange to take place, and that's what the Brown Bag series is starting to become. So we're really happy and excited to have you with us. This episode's topic really has everything to do with our two Bertha scholars who are with us on the call. Iris and Sampson, you would have read some of their bio information in the invitation and RSVP email. They've assured me that they'd prefer to have more time to talk and to present than for me to run through a more comprehensive bio. Just to say that I will say a little about the scholarship, the Bertha Scholarship Program in general at the end of this talk and Brown Bag before we close. But Iris will be presenting on feminist organizing for systems change in philanthropy, and Sampson on his topic, 23 languages and digital inclusion, comparing language policies and access to technology in Ghana, Rwanda, and South Africa. Both incredibly ambitious and widely relevant questions and themes, and we very much look forward to them sharing some of their research and practice journeys with us. We will have both presentations before moving on to the Q&A discussion section. Please go ahead and leave your questions, interests, insights, suggestions, whatever it is on your mind by using the Q&A function or by leaving your question or contribution in the chat box. And I will make sure to take notes and come back to all of your engagements when we get to the second part of this Brown Bag session. So without further ado and chatter, I'm going to hand over to Iris first. Please let me know if you have any issues on the back end and I will assist whilst you begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As I share my very work in progress dissertation topic, which is on feminist organizing for systems change in philanthropy. Just a brief overview of how I'll spend my 10 minutes. I'll start off with an introduction by situating this topic within the experiences and the curiosities that culminated in this focus. I'll then situate it within the context of the feminist funding ecosystem and speak to some of the actors and the dynamics that animate the space. I'll then very briefly share the theoretical framework and some of the scholarship that has really informed my understanding and the kinds of things that I'm observing within the feminist funding ecosystem, and then briefly reflect on some very early fieldwork reflections, as well as what I hope will be my contribution to the scholarship and praxis from this research. So my curiosity and my interest in this topic was spurred by three kind of core experiences. The first was my own experiences in strategic philanthropy, which illuminated to me how philanthropic best practice often contributes to the underfunding of feminist movements and women's rights organizations. I was curious about why only 1% of funding that is allocated to gender justice work actually reaches feminist movements and the women's rights organizations that are doing the most transformative work. Making reference to the image on the slide that was developed by Awid, what became clear to me is two things, that feminist funds that are part of a broader body of women's funds are the philanthropic entities whose funding flows directly reach feminist movements more directly. And number But two, which is a bit implicitly implied by the slide, but very explicitly argued in the report, is that there isn't necessarily a lack of funding within this funding ecosystem, but rather there is a diversion of funding away from the movements and the organizations that are doing the transformative work. The second experience that I was interested in was the prevalence within social justice or social change organizing spaces of the contradictions that may exist between a social purpose organization's external mission and its internal ways of working, and drawing on the invitation as embodied by the quotes that I included within the slide, to reimagine our current forms of organizing and the dynamics that are represented on the slide as well. My research is interested in exploring how paying attention to the inner lives of our organizing through positive institutional work supports efforts to advance systems change in philanthropy. I hope that my future research will go on to explore how this attentiveness might cultivate just institutional cultures and practices that are aligned to the system's work. Just as context, the research questions that I use to shape my research are as follows. The first one, which is my main one really, asks, how do feminists engage in the practice of positive institutional work within the feminist funding ecosystem? And some of the sub-questions speak to the contributions that I'd like to make theoretically. So the second is, how does this commitment to transform philanthropic practice influence how they organize internally? And how might an attentiveness to power expand our conceptualization of positive institutional work as well as systems change? So the feminist funding ecosystem is the context within which I'm exploring this topic. And my entry point into this ecosystem was initially through the work of feminist funds, which, as I mentioned earlier, are part of a broader body of women's funds. I was drawn to feminist funds because of their practice of feminist philanthropy, which is rooted in notions of justice and solidarity, and they've positioned their philanthropy as a political project to redistribute power through capital and accompaniment processes. And I was particularly intrigued by their positioning within the ecosystem because they positioned themselves as within movements and as movement support organizations, as opposed to positioning themselves as benevolent outsiders. Through the literature review, I shifted from this focus from feminist funds to the ecosystem more broadly, because one of the main components of systems change praxis that I discovered was about shifting the nature of the relationships between the different actors in the system. And so what I discovered when exploring this ecosystem is that there were a range of actors, including allied movements, who are also involved in social justice work that intersects with feminist movement building, such as climate change activism, for example, LGBTQIA+ organizing around labor rights, for example, or even racial justice. And there were other actors as well, such as civil society organizations who may not necessarily identify as feminists, but may have gender programming, for example, and do not position themselves as movement support organizations. It also illuminated the range of public and private funders that contribute to this ecosystem that oftentimes work alongside feminist movements and organizations, and in other instances have direct relationships with feminist funds to ensure that they're channeling funding flows directly to feminist movements and women's rights organizations. I think one of the things that have been refined through my literature review and some of my fieldwork interviews is that it's important to nuance the different types of resourcing or funding flows that goes towards feminist movements and women's rights organizations. Halima Mohammed in her work refers to two specific approaches. There's an internal resourcing approach, which is how movements resource their own work, whether it's through the skills, the knowledge, the talents, the time, the efforts, and the social capital of different members of the movement. And then there's also the external resourcing, which is what we often think about when we think about funding, that speaks to the philanthropic funding flows that emerge from private and from public funding. My theoretical framework is threefold. And what I've done on the slide is I've summarized kind of the key ideas or the definitions of each body of work. And in the case of feminist organizational research, which is quite a large body of work. I've summarized some of its key contributions so that I can move quite swiftly along. So owing to my own positionality as an African feminist, I was very curious about the power celibacy that I observed in the literature that did not speak explicitly to power. I then explored feminist organizational research in order to support my efforts to contribute to the literature by speaking more explicitly to the social reproduction of power and the deliberate actions that individuals and collectives pursue to disrupt power asymmetry through institutional work as a part of their practice of systems change. One of the questions that I've held throughout this process is, how does feminist praxis deepen or animate approaches to positive institutional work and systems change? And thus far, I found kind of 4 key practices or contributions. One is that it centers a critical power analysis and intersectionality in order to disrupt some implicit approaches to power. Secondly, it integrates collective care and healing, and I think this is in alignment with existing systems approaches. Thirdly, it names the meta-systems of oppression in order to bring a historicity to the reasons why different actors might be interested in systems change work. And it also experiments with new ways of being in relationship to ourselves and others in movement and organizational spaces, and therefore responds to this call to make different choices in our organizing that shapes how feminists themselves organize, how they build movements, how they lead, and how they build collective power. So very briefly, what is emerging in my fieldwork? I have attached a diagram that basically reflects some of the thinking around how systems change happens and the different levers that actors might tap into to try and shift the ways in which systems are reproduced within social contexts. What I've done on this slide as well is to represent in burgundy the things that I encountered in the literature, and then to represent in white the things that I started surfacing through my fieldwork interviews that are currently underway. I think the things that currently excite me right now about what is emerging from my very early fieldwork reflection is some of the institutional work that is being done to disrupt, to maintain, to reimagine mental models that are linked to technocratic approaches to social change, that are linked to colonial legacies of philanthropy as a sector, that are linked to the notion of trauma organizing, which is when individuals, organizations, and systems become fundamentally organized around the impact of chronic and toxic stress, even when it doesn't serve their organizing. And we see this showing up in the prevalence of burnout, for example, in our organizing. We see this in the lack of work-life balance, in what is called anxiety contagion, in overworking, for example, and seeing how different feminist actors within a range of collectives in the ecosystem are working to shift, tinker, and reimagine the prevalence of some of these mental models and dynamics. So there are 3 core contributions that I would like to make through this research. And I think at the heart of my intent is to bring feminist scholarship and praxis in conversation with positive institutional work and systems change literature within the context of philanthropy. And I believe that both kinds of literature benefit from this engagement. Feminist scholarship and praxis benefits from the useful frameworks that positive institutional work employs to explore situated agency in the context of institutional creation, maintenance, and disruption. And positive institutional work and systems change literature, conversely, benefits from the attention that feminist praxis and scholarship pays to power and how power shows up in spaces of collective organizing through frameworks like deep structures, inequality regimes, gender regimes, and through exploring the ways in which social power is reproduced in our collective organizing. They also outline some of the pathways to transformation that presents promise to how we think about positive institutional work and systems change. And so, yes, in that context, I do hope that my research contributes to theorizing on feminist systems change, that it really illuminates how our positive institutional work maintains or disrupts the reproduction of power and systems of oppression, And I also hope that it will contribute to the further development of positive institutional work with an attentiveness to power dynamics and how those show up in the context of our organizing. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you, Iris, and amazing presentation. All right. If you can hear me and you can see my slide, please let me know, Fergus. Waiting for your cue.
Yes.
Okay.
Got you.
All right. So my focus, well, basically my research, is centered on inclusive education. And I'm just going to go through my personal journey and how it relates to my research, because it's important for me to establish that. So in the picture that we see, in the slide that we see, there are about 4 pictures. These pictures were taken a few years ago. And a few years ago, I was part of this education project by the British Council. And I set up, went on a journey to really discover what education means to everyone, people within out of reach communities. And most of these communities were in the thick of the forest and places where people wouldn't go to on a normal day, with my colleagues. And we had a very interesting experience and also discovered quite a lot. So I have always had this passion for development, but as time went on, I really discovered where exactly I wanted to concentrate that passion in terms of a specific field where I could have or make enormous contributions. So thankfully, through the Bertha Scholarship, I was able to get onto this program to explore, again, work in progress, a dissertation or a research titled 23 Languages and Digital Inclusion, Comparing Language Policies and Access to Technology in 3 sub-Saharan African countries, specifically Ghana, Rwanda, and South Africa. And my name is Sampson Adotey. And all right, so moving straight into my presentation. So personally, throughout this journey, and I must emphasize that for the past close to 17 years of my life, I have been involved in a lot of grassroots work, and also helping different organizations at different capacities and levels to sort of contribute to development in different countries across sub-Saharan Africa. And so I noticed quite a number of things. And one of them is the opportunities that access to technology actually brings, and how transformative the power of access to technology is to communities. And an example is a group of farmers who, prior to the advent of mobile phones, used to have the price for their commodity stated by whoever was buying. And when they got access to mobile phones and they could actually check the price of commodities through a text message, they realized that they were actually being cheated and they could negotiate better. And all of us have had experiences at one point in time in recent years when WhatsApp went off. When WhatsApp wasn't working, we all went into panic mode. Everybody was trying to figure out what's happening because our messages weren't going through or whatsoever it is. The other thing that we need to also take note of is the fact that for over a decade or more, we've consistently seen a reduction in the levels of literacy and numeracy in many sub-Saharan African countries. And partly we could also, sort of blame COVID-19 for this, as it worsened and, further exacerbated this particular, the low levels. And that is also partly because of intermittent shutdown of schools and all of that. Now we're faced with, and many of us can attest to this, a possible youth bulge as we have very high unemployment levels across many sub-Saharan African countries. And, countries are continuing to struggle to develop programs that can actually address the needs of young people. And we have a great opportunity. And the great opportunity here is perhaps the fourth industrial revolution and many more that will come after this. So I sought to really understand how we could navigate this particular, navigate all the complexities within the systems that we find ourselves in. And so one of the things that I discovered in my research is that prior to COVID-19, there were several conversations about the fourth industrial revolution. And for instance, the future of jobs, the future of skills reports by the World Economic Forum, and all of that. And one of the mistakes we continue to make is that we assume that the fourth industrial revolution as it is can be applied to the African context, right? For example, what works in Europe and the US can, necessarily apply in the African context, which is false, because we have quite different systems and different structures. Whereas one group is economically developed, others are trying to figure out exactly how to build the foundations they need to be able to thrive and be competitive. And unfortunately, we do not have a universal standard of primary education across many African countries, because education in some countries is politicized. And again, funding remains a very big issue around education. Now, the concept of fourth industrial revolution is also founded on globalization and digital interactions that are unbounded by space. I remember growing up, I used to hear that, the world is a global village. The world is a global village. And, you hear this several times and you ask yourself, how is the world a global village? And I'm sure that many people in rural communities today cannot actually relate to that because they do not know, about the world out there. Because again, the lack of access to technology and basic digital infrastructure. So my study seeks to really understand how innovation in language policy can enable digital inclusion among learners as a foundation for realizing the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. And in order to really understand this, I embarked on a journey to sort of understand what exists out there in terms of literature. So far, what I've been able to consider as part of my work in progress is I have considered a lot of literature on educational technology to really understand the trends, what has been done in the past, what is currently being done, and what does the future look like. And also the theoretical underpinnings of educational technology, as well as the fourth industrial revolution in Africa. And Vykowski's sociocultural theory in language learning, the constructivism theory, the innovation diffusion theory in learning, and also examine the different education systems. Now, someone would ask, why are you doing a comparison between these three countries? And the reason is very simple. The three countries share very similar educational systems. And as a matter of fact, they are all hinged in sort of the colonial structures that we had. And in many instances, for instance, Ghana, despite having more than 40 languages, has 11 official languages that can be compared to South Africa, that has over 20 languages with 11 official languages. However, Rwanda is a very unique case as they only have one local language, which is also an official language outside English. So 3 English-speaking countries, 2 of these countries have 11 official languages that are used in schools. So when you go to school, you can study in Dagbani, or you can study in whichever of the 3 languages, 11 languages, either in South Africa or in Ghana. So I also examined, and I would want to highlight as part of the literature, the types of industrial revolutions, who led them, and the characteristics and the periods. Now, if you look at the first, which was led by the Great Britain, the idea was to shift from agrarian to mechanized production. Later, the United States also took the industrial revolution a step further by shifting to production and distribution in large quantities. And then again, the US, influenced by remarkable technological advances in computing and networks, also decided to take this a step further. So it was like a continuous improvement of, revolutions before. Describing digital technologies. So basically, the fourth industrial revolution describes how sophisticated digital technologies have become, how, their nature and shape, as well as what the future holds, beyond that particular, or beyond this particular revolution. And as we can see, we've moved from 4G to 5G, and there are even conversations around 6G at the moment and whatnot. Now, in terms of how I will be studying this particular, or in terms of how my study is going to take shape, I'm looking at a multiple case study. So the 3 different countries, very similar characteristics that will be teased out from my observations and interactions with my sample. I'm looking at a qualitative methodology, and my sampling strategy is basically purposeful, because I'm very keen to get to understand how we could improve, the psycho-educational experiences of both learners and teachers, by sort of taking a reflective approach to people's experiences, young people's experiences from the past, and what the future could be, and sort of aligning that. And again, semi-structured interviews and observations, content analysis. As a matter of fact, the data collection experience has been very unique. So I'm re-strategizing around how I can actually go ahead with data collection. And the idea really is to sort of like deeply understand individuals' experiences, and especially from the past, the present, and the future. I think we're going to come to the questions, but basically this is what my presentation or my study is about. And I'm looking forward to answering questions and having conversations around the goal and the core research question, and what I've seen so far. Thank you, Fergus.
Thanks so much, Sampson. That was, incredible to get an updated sense of where you've been and what you've been up to with that research journey. So while everybody is preparing their comments, the questions for both speakers, I'm going to put Khalib's question to you, Sampson. He's asking, what examples are there for us, and I guess for across the 3 case studies that you're looking into, from Asian tiger economies or from India in regards to global south and fourth industrial revolution? Any examples that have come across your desk, that have come across your experience?
So I must say that I have experienced several examples. I cannot name them at the moment because I don't have them on top of my mind, but I can tell you. So I spent some time in China, and I sort of had a real a first-hand experience of what it means to transform the systems within communities, and especially very impoverished communities. And I've seen it's a whole system that I'm going to try to see if I can map it up in 1 minute. So basically, the examples I can give you from China is there's a huge e-learning market in China. Today we're reading in the news that China is going on a lockdown. My friends in China have told me about how they woke up to fresh vegetables at their doorsteps and all of that, which is nice. But they have been, technically, COVID and its restrictions is forcing a lot of people to do a lot of online schooling. And many of these communities prior to COVID had seen a lot of growth and development. And I can give you, for instance, there's one community that I visited in the Dalian province, where private sector had collaborated with government to move the community from an impoverished community to a middle income community, right? So there was an overhaul of the entire community where, everybody is schooling now. Every child is schooling now. Every child has access to technology. Every child has access to fast internet. The digital infrastructure had been put in place. And this was done as a result of, government seeing the need for them to beat the SDGs. So unlike the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're sort of like making efforts. The government in China was very strategic to say that, look, every private organization adopt one community and help transform them from an impoverished community to at least a middle income, community. So what that meant was different companies adopted different communities and helped transform those communities. As a matter of fact, the community that I went to has a very interesting approach to development, where they allow a superstar to be a mayor for a week. So you can apply to be a mayor for the week, and you can use your status or your reputation to galvanize funding to support different projects within that particular community. And that was like a really cool experience that I had. And I was hoping, I'm hoping that at some point we can think about some of these examples. But there is a huge market for educational technology, as we can see with UCT Online High School and many other companies coming up, springing up, doing different things to ensure that education gets to everybody, and not just any type of education, but like quality education to help improve the digital skills of young people, because we basically need digital skills as part of the requirements to be active contributors in the fourth industrial revolution.
Thank you so much for your response, Sampson. I'm going to ask a follow-up to Khalid's question, and if you could just limit response time, and we'll move over to Pumza's question. But following on this example of comparative learnings or lessons, examples, when it comes to political will to invoke these kinds of innovative approaches to fourth industrial revolution, transition, etc. Are there any insights from your 3 case studies that maybe speaks to that, as to whether that's a key concern, key limitation, barrier to that kind of fourth industrial revolution change?
Okay, Fergus, I'm going to try and answer this very quickly. So, yes, there is political will. I've identified that there is political will across the 3 countries. To what extent it differs, right? So in South Africa, for instance, the president launched the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution and set up a task force to sort of work with different provinces around setting up like digital centers where young people could go for skills training. I've seen quite a number of programs happen in South Africa, which is quite distinct from what happens in Rwanda. As a matter of fact, yesterday in Rwanda, the government with the World Economic Forum launched the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution. And so we're beginning to see a lot of emphasis on the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Rwanda as an example, and that is going to feed later into the various legislations and priorities around financing education within Rwanda. In Ghana, we can say the same. We don't have a Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution. However, we've seen government's commitments to different activities. And my colleague Angela, who perhaps will be on the call, is currently running a program called the Girls in Mathematical Sciences program. It's a 9-month fellowship program. And that's like one of the many programs that is currently taking place in Ghana, where we're trying to get more young people to build the skills that they need, especially to be relevant in the fourth industrial revolution.
Thank you very much. And then over to Pumza's question, how does South Africa maneuver the infrastructure problem situation that we have? And what I'd like to do is actually put that to Iris and ask how, what comes up for you, what jumps up for you about that question, not necessarily from the perspective of your fieldwork only, but really from the perspective of your lens, your theoretical lens. So thinking about systems change, positive institutional work in the kinds of institutions, significant institutions and political representational spaces that, of course, have everything to do with infrastructure and development.
Thanks, Fergus. I have a few things. I'm hoping I'll summarize it into 3. I think the first thing that comes to me from my own lens is the sense around like narrative power and discourses, right? And how these discourses move and diffuse and become norms and aspirations, and a curiosity around, in light of the calls to reimagine things like development, how we approach development, how we even think about development, the matrices we use, right, to kind of give meaning and substance to development. How do things like the fourth industrial revolution support, for example, the continent, and how we reimagine our approaches to development to make them more holistic, to make them include things beyond GDP, for example, to make them include, different forms of matrices that really speak to the heart and the substance of how people experience their countries and their nations, beyond the production and the exchange of goods and services, which is an important part of the picture, but is not the whole picture. And I wonder about, sometimes, I have a curiosity around how these discourses serve us. There's obviously a lot of currency around advancing these things because of the direction in which the world is going, and the sense, that the continent doesn't want to play catch-up politics. And one of the things that comes up for me is the structural factors, both in global governance and also nationally and regionally, that enable or stifle those ambitions. I also, from a positive institutional lens, think of things like contradictory institutional logics. We see things like governments. There's this meme that has been going around that joked in the context of load shedding in South Africa, that spoke to how South Africa is prioritizing the fourth industrial revolution, but we can't even get the first industrial revolution challenge of electricity right, So there's these like contradictory institutional logics that animate governance, that animate social change work, that animate how we tap into discourses and norms within the context of our work, and that shape how we position some of these initiatives. And yeah, it's things that I found quite interesting, Sampson, through this question, and also questions that arose while you spoke about your very fascinating research topic.
Thanks so much for that, Iris. Sampson, given the question was directed generally, if you have any further comments to add on from what Iris responded to.
No, I totally agree with Iris. Like, her reflections are fantastic. And, these are some of the questions that I keep asking myself. And when I meet people, like, I keep asking, what does the fourth industrial revolution mean to you? What does education mean to you? What does access to technology mean to you? Right? And some of the feedback you get is it's really fascinating that education means different things to different people. In some communities, education basically means, we need to put this whole group into this class, make sure that they progress to like write the national exams, get into the university. If one person gets into the university, he can pull like 10 people along, right? And so that's what education means to them. So they're not aspiring to have everyone educated, just one person, and then that's good. And you can go to these people and tell them that, well, your idea of education is wrong. For them, they're living a good life. Why do you want to disturb my life? So ensuring that we're very participatory in nature and like, co-creating like the whole development process is very important. And, when Iris was talking about, not getting the first industrial revolution right, I can tell you for a fact that, I've been traveling for the past few weeks, and every country I've been to, I've experienced like load shedding a number of times, right? Like, so I keep asking, so where in Africa can I get like constant power? Where in Africa can I get internet? Today I make a call, like I go on my mobile data and I want to make a phone call. My call bounces to France before it comes to wherever I'm calling, because I'm in a Francophone country. So at the end of the day, you ask yourself, why do we have all these ridiculous charges and all these like this rates that sort of inhibits people's ability to do things and transact easily? And once we're able to sort of be frank with ourselves about the challenges that we're faced and getting our leaders, both at the national and local level, because often we tend to blame our national leaders for getting our local leaders. And sometimes really in the system, you'd realize that, well, if the local leaders were doing something, the national leaders would probably look better than they are. So yeah, we need to find a way to really get everybody involved. We all must be involved, and we need to have frank conversations about these things.
Thank you for that, Sampson. I'm going to move straight on to another question Talib posed. And this really helps to fit at the synergy intersection between both of your research and practice journeys. The question is, how does the Fourth Industrial Revolution offer us an opportunity to reset gender relations, equalizing in the virtual space rather than perpetuating status quo in respect to access, for example? And I guess handing over to Iris first, sort of any examples from institutions or organizations that are representing the kind of, or at least navigating the kind of questions that you're posing with the kind of lens that you're espousing, that perhaps links to Khalid's question.
Fergus, and thanks, Khalid, for that question. I think a few organizations and forms of activism come to mind. I think the first thing I want to say is one of the things that is highlighted by feminist organizing with regards to, for example, at the very basic level of internet access, is how women's digital participation is deeply influenced by digital violence against women. And so a lot of the advocacy that has been happening within that space has to highlight the digital and the virtual forms of gender-based violence that occur within the context of digital spaces. The second thing that has been quite interesting for me is also reflecting on some of the arguments that are made around, yes, absolutely, let's position women and queer people, to be at the heart of the fourth industrial revolution, and what experiences in other contexts, whether it's gender mainstreaming in politics or in business, for example, or in the military, what these experiences reveal is that, like a liberal feminist approach to it, where you just want to increase in a sense, the participation of people in a space without transforming the structures, the institutions, the cultures, the mental models that shape the inequality in that space becomes very rife and rigged in a sense, because you're bringing people into the space, which is great and is part of the work of justice, but it's not the only work. There's also work around transforming how we're engaging in those spaces, transforming the languages, the systems, the ways of working that often are parts of the reason why inequalities are often perpetuated or maintained within these contexts, and especially within the digital space as well. And I think lastly, to say that I know an important point of advocacy and movement building has been around internet governance, and how parts of the conversations around the fourth industrial revolution is also about democratizing the ways in which the internet is governed, and tilting it and shifting those systems more towards justice and towards democratic governance, as opposed to more kind of monopolistic approaches that we are observing within the space. And things like, for example, thinking about even practices around building algorithms, right, that are rooted in notions of equity and of justice, because oftentimes in the things that we have seen around algorithms, they tend to perpetuate biases that their coders and their creators hold. So really thinking about these different kind of spaces within the context of justice and saying, what might it look like to create algorithms that reflect notions of justice and equity? What might it look like to reimagine internet governance that is centered on people power and is centered on justice? What might it look like to really transform the ways we are engaging within the digital space, so that it's not only about a sense of participation, but also a sense of ownership around how we design and create space for people to form communities in the context of digital and virtual spaces.
Just again, if anybody would like to pop a question or add their voice, insights, ideas, please go ahead, raise your hand or use the Q&A function, or pop your question in the chat box. And in the meantime, while you're thinking of that, I'd like to ask both Sampson and Iris, for those of us on the call who are really intrigued by your research journey so far, and would actually be quite interested in following that journey, perhaps even contributing insight or being involved in any way, shape or form, and following some of the recommendations and down the road findings that your research will no doubt have. How do we keep in contact with you? How do we, if at all possible, how do we track this incredible research journey that you're both on? Is there a call to action you might have for us, or an invitation for different ways of participating or engaging with your research journey? And I'll start with you, Sampson.
Beckers, allow me to take a dig at Iris's response briefly.
Sure, absolutely.
So I totally, agree, and I think there's a reason why Iris and I are cousins, MPhil cousins. So one thing I need to emphasize is that we need to bring developers into this particular conversation, right? People who write algorithms. We need to start teaching them about these things and the importance of ensuring that we hold spaces, for transformation. We hold spaces for such conversations. Because at the end of the day, we have these conversations without these people, we would continue to sort of, whatever it is, the inequality is being perpetuated as a result of the lack of knowledge or the lack of insight into the harm that we're causing people would continue to go on for a very long time. So we need to hold spaces for, sort of have like that cross-disciplinary conversation around transformation, feminist movements. How do we, sort of ensure that we reset gender relations? And this is like something that I'm very looking forward to, as much as possible contribute to, and with the work that I do privately. Now, in terms of how you can reach me, I'm on LinkedIn. You can always ping me. I am also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Black Storyteller, Black with a Q, BALQSTORYTELLER. However, if you want to follow my research journey, what I actually try to do very often is I sort of, as a global shaper of the World Economic Forum, use that platform to write some of and share some of the insights that I gain from my personal journey, with my research. So I tend to write a lot. And so I sort of try to contribute thought leadership to some of these discussions. And I will drop a link to one of the recent publications. It has a link to to a way for you to contact me. And please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to, provide you with any updates on the work I've done so far.
Thank you very much, Sampson. And over to you, Iris. And of course, you're most welcome to respond to his dig before sharing some of the channels that you might use to share your research. Over to you.
Fergus, I was just saying in the chat, Sampson, that I concur with you, and there are already some amazing feminists doing that bridging work, which is a systems competency in the space. And I would be happy to connect you to the movements and the individuals and collectives who are really creating those spaces for social change movements to meet people in the internet governance space across their various competencies. Right. So thank you for raising that, Sampson. And yes, if you'd firstly, open invitation to, if you have any recommendations for organizations I should speak to, people that you think are aligned to my research, please feel free to contact me. I've dropped my email address, both my personal email address and, oh my, a very wrong UCT email address. I'll change that in the chat. And if you'd just like to connect, this research is also my work. It's the work that I do. I have the privilege of having both of it intersect in the most marvelous of ways. And so if you want to reflect on your own experiences, I'm very happy to connect via email. I'm not really on social media, but I do have handles. My Twitter handle is @Iris-Nxumalo. I'm also on LinkedIn as Iris-Nxumalo-De, and you can find me there, but email is the most reliable. I'm hoping, and I hope the universe will align with me, that my research will be done by the end of this year. And I'm really hoping to package bits of it into summaries that I can share with people, that I can share with the organizations and the activists that I've been engaging with, and that I can share with people who are interested in it. And so please do keep in touch via email, and I'll share those copies once they become available.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I have two handfuls of organization spaces that I'd very much like to chat to you about as possible examples and sites to study and action research. All right, so just before I close the session, if there are any more voices, any more raised hands, questions, engagements, ideas, just giving a moment for that. I will have a look, see if I've missed anybody. Nothing yet, nothing here. And we've covered all the questions. So I'm going to say a few words on the Bertha Scholarship Program and then close the session. But whilst I do that, please don't hesitate to throw the questions. Okay, there we have a comment from Maurita. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Your name right. Yeah, I'm also blown away. This is often the case with the Bertha Scholars. So the Bertha Scholarship Program is one of the Bertha Centre's first programs that we deliver, where we fund and introduce scholars, maverick thinkers, activists, researchers across the continent to come to the Graduate School of Business and study either the MBA modular or full-time or the MPhil, specializing in inclusive innovation studies. And we see the scholarship both as a way of bringing activist-minded social justice leaders into Africa's leading business school, but also really to enhance and build a network of people with resources and skills for whom are ready to share, really, and involved in that network effect. One of the incredible values of the scholarship program is really the emergent possibilities, opportunities, and coalitions that form over the course of the scholars program in for an MBA at the GSB, but also long after. And we are proud and glad to have many of our alumni scholars still participating, still involved in the broader Bertha Centre and Bertha ecosystem across the continent with their inspiring and incredibly thoughtful and challenging work. A big part of being a scholar is getting into the thick of the uncertainty, complexity of the issues that we care most about. And so just a giant thank you to both Iris and to Sampson, not only for your presentations and sharing today, but also for being incredible ambassadors and examples of what the Bertha Scholarship Program and of course the Bertha Centre stands for, carrying a systems lens to the deep commitment to socioeconomic justice that we so hold. So once again, thank you so much. There are a couple of comments coming through in the chat box. I just want to make sure that none of them are burning questions. Oops, here's a burning question. Thanks, Brielwa, and to guest, anonymous guest, but just quickly to speak this one out. Interesting topics, great work. Question is directed to Iris. Iris, could you have a quick go at this one? This is this is a good one. My interest is around the decolonial comment you made. Do existing funder donor organizations that are of African descent seem to have interest in reforming how they fund feminist movements? It's a big one, but if you have a couple of sentences for us before we close the call, that would be wonderful. Over to you, Iris.
Fergus. Yes, a lot of the people that I've spoken to are from African philanthropic organizations that are actually at the forefront of supporting this effort to decolonize philanthropy and do it in different ways using different forms of language as well. I think one of the tricky, interesting things in philanthropy is that there are a lot more conversations now around shifting power and around decolonizing philanthropy. But really the trick is the substance, the degree to which the rhetoric is matched with action organizationally, is matched with action in their grant-making practice, is matched with action in terms of who they employ, how they do it, the voices that they're centralizing, the knowledge that they center, right, to inform their ways of working. So there is a sense in the space that there's a lot of rhetoric, but the action is lagging behind. But there are some pioneering African philanthropic organizations who are really at the forefront of walking the talk in that regard, and also have their own sense of ambivalence towards the current shape of the conversation that doesn't always reflect some of the dynamics that are at the heart of African philanthropy and the different types of philanthropic organizing that we have. And so part of that conversation as well for African philanthropic organizations is to center the indigenous forms of philanthropy that were often, right, trust-based, all these things that people are demanding for in institutionalized philanthropy that are trust-based, that are based on mutuality, that affirm agency, that are rooted in solidarity and a notion of justice and care. All of these things are things that we've been doing in our own individual and kind of community philanthropic practice. And now there's these desires to match some of those experiences with the broader calls around what decolonization could look like in philanthropy and the ways in which we organize and fund movements.
I speaking personally, I wish we can continue along that exact line of thinking and inquiry, but we are now on the hour. I want to thank everybody for spending an hour of your Friday with us today, and know that you will receive a mail with, I believe, the recording and any other material resources connected to this fourth episode of the Centre's Brown Bag series. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one, and preferably before that. The next Brown Bag will take place on the 3rd of June. More information to come on that via the follow-up email to this session and Bertha Centre's newsletter. Again, a big thanks to Iris, to Sampson. Thanks to Anna for your support, and to everybody for engaging in this fascinating discussion. Thank you. Cheers, Khalid.